Absinthe. The mythical muse of artists and writers has a strong claim to being the most notorious spirit of all time. But what exactly is the Green Fairy, and does it deserve its infamy, or was it the victim of a relentless smear campaign? Let's take a deep dive into the green-tinged liquid which is reappearing on back bars everywhere. This video is brought to you in partnership with A+, which is a new website hosting content for and by the hospitality industry. Definitely check them out below. Wormwood has been used to treat a variety of ailments as far back as ancient Egypt. Its Latin name is Artemisia absinthium, and in ancient Greece it was often soaked in wine to create sort of a medicinal tonic. Wormwood itself, though, is unbearably bitter, and so there have been many attempts to make it more palatable throughout the years, vermouth being an obvious example. One other such attempter was Dr. Ordinaire, a French physician who fled to Switzerland to escape the French Revolution in the late 1700s, and he landed on a concoction which used 15 botanicals, including licorice, star anise, and sweet fennel, to mask the bitterness of the wormwood, forming the distinctive aniseed taste that we now expect. He took the name from the wormwood, calling it extrait d'absinthe, and patented it. There's also a claim to the recipe from some sisters living in the same Swiss town, but they sound much less like evil supervillains than Dr. Ordinaire, so he gets the credit. What is definite though is that commercial distillation of absinthe was started by a family who came to be known after a couple of marriages, opening a second distillery in France and losing a few letters from their surname, as the Pernod's, and they remain one of the biggest names in absinthe to this day. Good quality absinthe is distilled in much the same way as good quality gin, so botanicals are steeped in neutral alcohol and then redistilled to subdue bitterness and create complexity. Coming straight off the still, absinthe is clear, and then the green colour comes from another maceration of herbs afterwards, and this also imparts some extra aroma and a tannin-like structure. So, there we have it. Absinthe is a Swiss-born distilled spirit happily adopted by the French. It contains wormwood and has a predominantly aniseed flavouring. Yes, it does tend to be quite high in alcohol, but it doesn't really sound so scary, does it? The problem, you see, is that the French took to this new libation rather too enthusiastically. The French armed forces were prescribed wormwood, often in the form of absinthe, to ward off malaria while fighting in North Africa, and developed a taste for it. Civilians were happy to align themselves with these conquering heroes as they were seen, and un verre becomes a fashionable order in bars and cafes all over France. Then, disaster struck the French wine industry. Phylloxera, which is a root disease, decimated them, and fashionable or not, absinthe was cheap and abundant and primed to fill the gap. By 1849, France had 26 absinthe distilleries and was consuming about 10 million litres of absinthe a year. Meanwhile, a golden era of cocktails was happening in the United States, and in the heavily French-influenced New Orleans, the herbal flavouring was being put to good use in stylish drinks such as the Sazerac. Absinthe was seen as a great equaliser, enjoyed by both rich and poor, often from the same absinthe fountains. Its mythology began to grow, fueled by creative geniuses such as Baudelaire and Manet, who claimed altered perceptions and a sense of liberation were to be found at the bottom of an absinthe goblet. One can't help but feel that many of these men would have found such enlightenment and perhaps a little dose of crazy at the bottom of anything that they happened to sup from. But it is fair to say that some of the distilleries pumping out absinthe to meet the ever-rising demand were rather more unscrupulous than good old Pernod FE, and there were harmful additives such as copper sulfate and antimony trichloride being used to mimic the effects created by the botanicals, which were much more expensive. The main man we have to thank, though, for the demonization of the licorice-laced liquor was a Dr. Valentin Magnan, whose rather flawed understanding of scientific process meant he thought it was totally reasonable to test the effects of absinthe versus alcohol by feeding pure wormwood oil to lab animals and then use their resulting convulsions to substantiate claims of an absinthe madness distinct from just being drunk. Now, those of you who are paying attention might remember that absinthe is not the only alcoholic product to contain wormwood. Vermouth is also literally named after it. So, why was that wine-based product never stigmatized in the same way? Well, the wine industry in France was recovering, and they weren't particularly happy to have lost such a large share of their market to a green upstart which used none of their product. By 1880, many Parisians would order absinthe by asking for une correspondance, or a ticket to Charenton, the local insane asylum, so convinced were people of the hallucinogenic effects caused by absinthe-induced madness, or absinthism, much talked about in the press. In Switzerland in 1905, a terrible murder was attributed to it. Despite the fact that the man had drank literally litres of strong wine as well as brandy that day, the 2 measures of absinthe that he consumed in the morning were deemed responsible for his awful decision to shoot his whole family, a conclusion actually based heavily on Dr. Magnan's flawed experiment. The wine industry in Prohibitionists proved a powerful lobby, and the reputation of absinthe was in tatters. The bans began. Switzerland, Belgium, the US, and eventually France, among others, sent the Green Fairy, now more commonly known as the Green Devil, into exile. So, if absinthe died out, then why are we still talking about it? Well, that's because it never really did. What's that? Abstinence doesn't work? Shocker. In Switzerland, absinthe production went underground, and some countries like Spain, where Pernod moved their factory to, never actually banned it, but its popularity definitely did dwindle. At least until the 1990s. The Czech Republic had also never banned absinthe, but production did stop under their communist regime. When it fell in the 1990s, they began to make absinthe again, which of course proved a huge novelty to tourists already hyped up on €1 beers. All these guys really wanted was to say that they'd tried the forbidden fruit, so the higher in alcohol and more luridly green the better, and a lot of substandard and improperly made products appeared to fill demand. Now, my lawyer brain loves this next bit, and I have to give full credit to Difford's Guide for this story because I didn't actually know about it before I was researching this. But apparently we really have an Englishman named George Rowley and his tenacity with EU regulations to thank for absinthe's revival. He had fallen in love with Prague while living there, and when he moved back to the UK, started importing the Czech Pilsners and so on that he'd discovered. One thing that he wanted to import was Hill's absinthe, but it was illegal, or so everyone assumed. Here's the thing, the UK had actually never banned absinthe. When France did, supplies just dried up and they just sort of let it be. So all Rowley had to do was get it past a European Union import directive, and then due to the EU system, if it could be sold in the UK, it could be sold in every member state, even France. Rowley also realised that France had never actually banned the production of absinthe, just the sale, and so he looked to find and revive a traditional absinthe distillery purely for export, and Lafite was born, a high-quality product based on a pre-ban recipe which led the way for the new wave. These legal loopholes laid the groundwork for the Green Fairy to rise from the dead. So, are we all headed to wreck and ruin in an aniseed-smelling fug? As legal restrictions relaxed, modern scientists took a closer look. Sujone, the essence of wormwood, was long deemed the culprit for any hallucinogenic effect, but none has been proved. In very high doses, it can cause spasms and convulsions, as in Magnan's lab experiment, but you would die of alcohol poisoning long before you could ingest enough from absinthe. Lots of countries, including the US, have regulations around Sujone levels, but traditional absinthe never contained high levels anyway. In all likelihood, the high alcohol content was the problem all along. So, absinthe louches all round, but only one or two. With all of this chatting about the history and mystique of this storied spirit, I'm getting a little thirsty. Probably about time we look at some absinthe serves and cocktails, so make sure you've subscribed and hit the notification bell so you don't miss out when that video drops. And thank you very much again to A+ for partnering with this episode and letting me indulge a little bit of history nerdiness. Absinthe. So now you know.